and buenos dias. I regret that I don't speak more than schoolgirl Spanish today. It sounds like you've had a very, a very fascinating discussion. I think I'm going to see some translations afterwards. So I've worked in the digital workplace industry for over 20 years. So working with large corporates and public sector organizations, mainly in the UK and the US, to help them make better use of technology in the workplace. In the last 4 or 5 years, I've become a big advocate for digital skills in the workplace, and also for digital well-being. And I'm now doing part-time doctoral research at the University of Nottingham here in the UK, looking at the dark side of digital working, so things like techno-stress, computer anxiety, information overload, and addiction. And I'm also looking at the potential for mindfulness, so qualities of mindful, present-focused awareness to actually help cultivate a healthier relationship with our technology. So it's a particularly interesting time to be working in this area. I'm talking to quite a lot of organizations at the moment as they start to think about, hybrid working, and also, thinking about how have people coped during the pandemic. Obviously, a lot more workers, particularly knowledge workers, working digitally. And of course, there has been an uplift in digital skills, which is great to see, but I think that we still have some issues that we need to address to look after the mental health of our workforce. And one of the biggest issues, perhaps the one that comes to mind most readily for a lot of us, is overload. So too much information. There was a recent Dutch study that found that around a third of knowledge workers receive so much information in a day that they have difficulty processing it. Another study by Pegasystems found that employees are switching between 35 key applications, as many as 1,100 times a day. So there's a lot of jumping around, and then also being interrupted. So again, another study, and I've been reviewing a lot of the research in this area for my PhD, finding that only half of the workday is spent on work episodes, and those are often less than 10 minutes. So we've seen great benefits. We couldn't have continued to be productive and kept working, particularly in the last year, without these tools. But there are also some downsides that we need to address as well. And those are leading into stress and strain, burnout, reduced well-being for employees, and that's knocking on to lower satisfaction and commitment to the organization. And as you might expect, it's then affecting performance and productivity. And we perhaps don't really know the cost also to organizations. There was one study, it's a little bit old now, looking at the cost of overload to organizations, which estimated a cost of something like $900 billion as the cost of information overload to the US economy in terms of lowered employee productivity and reduced innovation. Stress, we perhaps know a bit more about, and there are some very big figures around the cost of stress to the economy in the workplace. And there's certainly evidence that the use of workplace technology is contributing to that. So when we think about digital well-being in the workplace, you get ideas of living a good life while using technology, having some kind of balance of connection and disconnection, and of course being able to maintain mental, physical, and social and emotional health. And there's an element of awareness. So for employees and workers, really having an understanding both of the upsides of the technology, but also the downsides. So what can go wrong when we're working digitally, and then also being aware of our own digital practices. So sometimes when I talk to teams in organizations, we have some really interesting conversations where they start to reflect as individuals, but also as a team, on what are their digital practices, and are they overconnected? Are they supporting their well-being, or are they leading into burnout? Digital skills is a huge part of this. So I tend to say there's no digital well-being without digital skills. Organizations really need to think a lot more holistically about digital skills. So we often see in the learning space that an organization rolls out a technology, and maybe there's a little bit of learning that goes with it. And then there's another piece of technology and a little piece of learning. So we actually need to go much broader and think about a set of digital skills to use those tools, but also to really be able to communicate well, to look after our own sense of well-being, to manage our identity, etc., etc. So digital skills play an important part. And then some aspects of control and autonomy. So actually having access to the right support and resources to really optimize digital working practices, and ideally having some degree of choice over how to use the technology. The technology may be mandated, but creating some sense of autonomy can really help. Something that I think is really interesting in this area is that if we think about the physical workplace, we talk about hazards and harms. So someone falls off a ladder, it's very clear that that's a hazard that we need to pay attention to. And so we have risk management policies for that. In the digital workplace, equally, we have certain hazards and harms. And I think that we need to start to think a lot more about how we manage those risks. Just having a really clear view of what can happen. And so some of those hazards I've mentioned, overload in particular, and the interruptiveness of the technology. Sometimes it's also about the sheer pressure and pace of technology. So the effort people have to put in to keep learning new technologies, the sort of unsettling effect of upgrades and changes, the constant pressure, and also a faster work pace that often comes with technology. The blurring of work and life, I think we all experience, and that's been challenging in different ways for different people in the last year or so. And certainly I've talked to people who just say, well, now my workday doesn't seem to end, I just keep working and I'm on my computer. So somehow, this blurring that's happening between work and life. Also, something that's gone up a lot during the pandemic is monitoring of people, and that's monitoring the work of employees and also how they're using technology. Now, monitoring isn't necessarily bad, but often it's brought in ways that make it quite detrimental for people, and be an invasion of privacy and cause a lot of stress and strain. So it's an area that we need to pay quite a lot of attention to. And then addictiveness. So who would have thought, if we think back 10 years, that we would have thought that, workplace technology, might become really addictive. I suppose email's been addictive for a while, but, with smartphones and tablets and, social media in the workplace, there is that aspect of fear of missing out and using the technology in an excessive way. And that's leading into techno harms, as I'm referring to them. So a level of stress and strain that's building up, and ultimately that's turning into burnout. So particularly what I've seen in the research is a real sense of emotional exhaustion. So things like overload, interruptions, really leading into a sense of fatigue and exhaustion from employees. Reduced well-being for people, a sense of anxiety, and that can even be as much as a kind of a sense of phobia relating to using digital tools, impacting on health and potentially sleep, and then also eroding satisfaction. So that kind of felt sense of really being satisfied, both with the organization and with the technology itself. what we can do about this, I think we need to look at 3 levels. So the level of the organization, the technology itself, and also at the individual and team level. So for the organization, elements that have been found to be really important are the organizational climate and norms. So, you know, what people see leaders doing, sending messages in the middle of the night. This is a difficult one, and I know in some countries there are, you know, there is a stronger right to disconnect, but not in all. So looking at the norms around technology use, that might be the policies and the practices, also the leadership style and support. So, you know, when I'm interviewing organizations, quite often see leaders not really walking the talk, really kind of leading the way in how they lead in digital workplace. Looking again at support and training, and trying to get away from this model of just training for one technology and having something that's much more about how to kind of live your life and do your work in a modern organization, involving people, of course, in change and encouraging people to play with the technology. So often people don't feel that they can really do that, and giving them some kind of autonomy around, you know, one of the great benefits of the technology is having greater autonomy in our jobs. And then at the level of the technology itself, so we need to think about, and I'm sure I've caught some mentions of this, around designing for usability, and so that we can reduce cognitive load, ensuring that tools are accessible and inclusive, and also looking at how we can kind of fit the technology to the person and the task. And then the individual level, I think, is really interesting. That's where we get into digital literacy, fostering a sense of confidence with technology, helping people with coping strategies. I think one of the really interesting areas is looking at how teams work together. So if I try to change my digital practices, perhaps I try to set some boundaries and say I'm working on a team with Laura, and you know, if we haven't talked about that, she might be wondering, why isn't Elizabeth replying to my emails? But if as a team we sit down and look at how we're collaborating and perhaps make some agreements, you know, there might be some people on the team who really enjoy multitasking. We know it doesn't really exist, but, you know, jumping around different applications. Other people might really need to do more focused tasks. So I think there's an opportunity there. So I'm gonna stop there. I'd love to see.
That's actually perfect timing, because I was just waiting, you know, for my moment to ask you a question, because it's just wonderful information you have shared, Elizabeth, and thank you so much. I am so inspired, and I have so many things I want to ask, but let me prioritize. That's one of the things I learned in the digital world as well, in terms of communication, is to prioritize, you know, and be clear on what you want to communicate. But I think my most important question is really based on my experience, which I will tell you a little bit about in a few minutes, would be, in order for a digital team to work or a digital organization to function well, could you share your viewpoint on what part of the responsibility belongs to the job giver, to the boss, to the management level? What are their responsibilities? What, very practically, what are the top 3 things they need to think about, to implement, or to make the teams focus on? And on the other hand, what are, let's say, the top 3 things that the team, the employee, you know, the individual need to think of in order what to ask, what to demand from the management for the digital team to function well?
They're good questions. And I kind of surrounding that as well, there's the digital workplace itself. So if the digital workplace, the tools are really pretty awful and not very usable, then, you know, no matter what the leaders and managers and people do, it's going to be quite hard. But, you know, that's another kind of part of the equation that we need to look at. I think for I think for managers, and it's a lot about how managers get supported. So, often I see that managers get training around tools for remote management, so maybe Teams or Zoom, but not necessarily the training to the softer skills. So how to actually create a sense of connection, as we're connecting online, how to, bring the team together and support people, the importance of, allowing time, not just for work, but also to connect and have that more social element. So I think for managers, really increasing their those kind of soft, really important skills is critical. And then finding how to express their own leadership style within the digital world. And again, that might be something that they need support from communicators or champions or change agents. So not thinking, there's all of this enterprise social media and there's these different channels and somehow I've got to do all of this, but actually really looking at, well, what do my people need, but also what suits with my own style for communicating as well. So, I mean, that's from the manager level. And then, of course, leading by example. So if managers are, sending things at strange times of night, it doesn't help. And I recognize that, and I've had one boss who said specifically to the team, look, it just works for my pattern of work. Sometimes I work on a Sunday evening. I'm not a workaholic. I do have downtime, but it doesn't mean you have to reply. So I want you to ignore my emails until the time when you're working. So, he gave a good lead to the team that he didn't expect people just to be replying. So that's my slightly convoluted answer on the manager side. For us as individuals, I think that we need to, and I think people really want this from organizations, is to ask for the support with the digital literacy. So things like not just e-learning, but networks of champions have been shown to be really effective to support people. We all like to sit down with someone to help us, whether that's virtually or in person. And also to use things like Yammer and whatever the organization has to start to form communities and have conversations about, how we're using tools and what works. And I think that really starts, as I said, within the immediate team. So if the immediate team can start to, have those discussions about just stepping back for a moment and looking at how we're working digitally, how we're collaborating, and perhaps how we can just fine tune that a bit as well.
That's good. I have actually a very, very personal experience in many ways with the digital work and digital life and studies and keeping in contact with my family, because for the past 10 years, I live abroad and I've been living in 6 different countries. And really all of this enabled by the technologies, I believe, starting from the fact that allowed me to feel close to home, close to my family, which motivated me to stay longer, far away physically, to the fact that I could live in the Philippines and write my master thesis for the Danish university where I studied at the time, to the last event in my life was where I worked in Denmark as a brand manager, and I was the only and the first person in the company who was relocated to Spain, Valencia. That's where I met Juanjo as well, and that's why I'm actually here. And all of this was possible because we gave trust to the technology and we said, hey, this is possible. It's scary. We don't know how to do that, but hey, we learn by doing. Let's go, let's communicate. I think the only thing we agreed between me and my team was let's communicate. Everything that comes along the way, let's communicate. So, and then of course, there was a big personal development job to do for me and for my manager who stayed in Denmark, letting me, the only employee, to go to Spain and work remotely. And here, of course, there were some skills I had to learn just, by feeling what feels annoying and trying to observe myself and the efficiency and see, okay, what is I need to learn? But from the research point of view, in terms of skills that employees should really practice if they want to thrive in the digital environment, what would you say are the most important skills for us to practice?
Well, I think you've just hit on one of them, actually, because while we need certain definite skills to use certain technologies to communicate, collaborate, we need to be able to understand how to process information, so good search. But what you've just said is that, you learnt by doing, and also, that reflection as well. So in my, maybe I'll just share this one slide, might just be helpful. Just going to share so we can see. So this is, hopefully you can see. So this is the digital workplace skills framework that I published. I think you've all got a link to it. So that we think about, yes, we need to kind of get the basic skills. We need to stay safe. We also need to then kind of optimize our practices. We need to think about how we use information and data safely, appropriately, etc. All of the kind of creating and content, connecting with people. And then this, I feel that on a par with those things is thinking about and adapting our digital practices. So, we all have, we may be employees or whatever role we're in, but we also have a responsibility, hopefully supported by the organization, to really kind of reflect on our own practices and to look at how we can, perhaps take the time sometimes to learn new things, to have that curiosity, to take the opportunities that are there to really learn. And there are so many now. So, what you described with your manager and sort of learning to some extent by trial and error and being open to that experience, I think that's really important as well.
And I think it's also because, honestly, like, it's one of those when you have to learn to feel comfortable with the uncomfortable. So